She is a pleasant enough creature, I grant you, said Cassian, Duke of Grenholm, swirling the wine in his glass without once glancing at the woman seated at the foot of his own table. But let us be honest among friends, no one has ever accused my wife of being a beauty. Plain and dutiful and quiet. A man could not ask for anything more restful, and a man could not ask for anything less remembered. The laughter came easily, the way laughter always came at the Duke of Grenholm's table, for the men who dined there wished to be counted his friends, and the women wished their names spoken kindly in his drawing rooms. Candlelight leapt along the silver, and the great chandelier of the long dining hall at Grenholm Court cast its trembling gold upon the faces turned toward him, and Cassian, warm with wine and the pleasure of being listened to, did not think to look down the length of the polished mahogany to where the Duchess sat. If he had looked, he might have seen it. He might have seen the small stillness that came over her, the way her hand paused above her plate and then, very deliberately, set down the fork without a sound. He might have seen the color leave her cheeks and something quieter and far more terrible than tears settle into her eyes. But he did not look. He had grown so accustomed to not looking that he no longer knew he was doing it. "Come, Grenholm, you wrong her," said Lord Merrow from halfway down the table, though he was smiling as he said it, for he too had drunk well. "She has a fine seat on a horse. I saw her take the North Heath hedge last autumn as though she were born to it." "Did she?" said Cassian, and this was the worst of it, though he would not understand for a long time yet how much worse. He did not even remember. "There, you see. A fine seat on a horse. I shall have it engraved upon the family plate. Here lies restfulness itself." And the laughter rose again, and he leaned back in his chair, satisfied, a man of 42 who had never in his life wanted for anything and had therefore never learned to value the things that were quietly, faithfully his. At the foot of the table, Evelina, Duchess of Grenholm, lifted her chin a very little. She did not weep. She did not flinch nor color, nor let her gaze fall to her lap the way a mortified woman might. She looked at her husband for the length of one long breath, and there was in that look no anger that any of the guests could name, only a kind of grave and final attention, as though she were fixing something in her memory. Then she turned to the footman at her shoulder and said, in a voice so composed that no one nearby thought anything of it, "I find I am rather tired this evening. Will you convey my apologies to the company? I shall retire." She rose. The gentleman nearest her rose too, from habit rather than regard, and she curtsied to the room, to her guests, and last of all, with a small and perfect gravity, to her husband at the head of his table. It was a curtsy so correct, so beautifully made, that a more careful man might have felt the ground shift beneath him. Cassian only inclined his head, already turning back to Lord Merrow, and by the time he thought to glance toward the door she had gone through it, and the door had closed, and the sound of it was lost beneath the din of his own hospitality. He remembered, in the long months that followed, that he had not watched her leave. He would remember it 1,000 times. The dinner went on. There was more wine and a game of cards in the Blue Saloon, and at some hour past 1 in the morning the last carriage rolled away down the avenue of limes, and the great house fell quiet around him. Cassian climbed the stairs alone, as he generally did, and passed the door of his wife's apartments without a thought, and slept the untroubled sleep of a man who believed his world to be arranged exactly as he wished it. He woke to grey light and to silence, and at first the silence meant nothing to him. His valet came and shaved him and dressed him, and it was only over his coffee, when the man seemed to hover and hesitate in a way that valets did not, that Cassian looked up and said, "Well, Price, what is it?" "Her Grace, my lord." The man's face was carefully blank in the way of good servants who have decided that something is not their affair and are frightened of it all the same. "Her Grace's maid asks to speak with you. She has been asking since 7 o'clock. Some faint cold thing moved at the back of Cassian's mind, too far off to be called alarm. "Send her in." The maid, a stout sensible woman named Datchet, who had come with the Duchess from her father's house years ago, entered with red-rimmed eyes and a letter held before her in both hands as though it were a live coal. "Her Grace is gone, my lord," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "She rose before dawn. She had me pack her trunk last night, and she took the early carriage to the crossroads to meet the York mail. She bade me give you this." and she bade me tell you that she is quite well, and that you are not to trouble the household on her account." Cassian set down his cup. It struck the saucer harder than he intended, and the small bright sound of it seemed very loud in the room. "Go where?" "She did not say, my lord. She said only that I would know she was safe, and that I was not to be afraid for her, and that I was to serve you faithfully as she has always wished." The woman's chin trembled. "But I could not, my lord. I could not stay another hour in a house she has left. I have packed my own things. I ask leave to follow her, wherever she has gone, for I have served her since she was a girl, and I will not leave her now." He heard the reproach in it, though the woman would never have dared to speak it plainly, and something in him rose to strike it down, the ducal instinct, the reflex of a lifetime, that no servant should presume to grieve at him. But the letter was in his hand now, and Evelena's writing was upon it, that small even hand he had seen 1,000 times upon household accounts and invitation lists, and never once, he realized, upon anything addressed to himself. He broke the seal. "My lord," it began, "not my dear husband, not even Cassian, but my lord," the address a subject might use, cool and correct and terrible. "When you read this I shall be some distance from Grenholm, and I beg you will not send after me, for it can serve no purpose, and would only distress us both. I have been your wife for 11 years. In that time I have kept your houses, ordered your table, nursed your tenants through fever, buried your old nurse, and stood at your side before the whole of the county without once giving you cause to blush for me. I have asked you for nothing. Last night at your own table, before your friends, you told them what I have long known you believed, and had the kindness, until now, never to say aloud, that I am plain and dull and easily forgotten. I do not write to reproach you for thinking it. A man cannot help his heart. I write only to tell you that I find I can no longer sit at the foot of a table where I am the evening's amusement, and be grateful for the honor. I do not blame you, Cassian. You have been, in your way, a generous husband. You have never been cruel to me by design, and I think that is the sorrow of it. They did not even find me worth the trouble of unkindness. I release you from the trouble of me entirely. Live as pleases you. I ask only that you leave me to do the same. I remain, though you will scarcely feel the loss of it, your wife." Cassian read it once, and then, because the words seemed to slide from the surface of his understanding without penetrating it, he read it again. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, in the great machinery of the household, a door closed and a servant's feet went along a flagged passage, and a clock upon the mantel ticked with an idiot patience, and the Duke of Grenholm sat with his wife's letter in his hand and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the floor of the world tilt very slightly beneath him. "There will be some misunderstanding," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, too smooth, a stranger's voice reciting a stranger's lines. "She has taken a fancy to visit her aunt, perhaps at Bath. She will write in a day or two and think better of it." Datchet said nothing. She only looked at him with those red-rimmed eyes, and in her silence he understood that she, a serving woman, knew something about his wife that he, the husband of 11 years, did not. That Evelina Grenholm was not a woman who took fancies. That she had never in her life done a thing she had not first considered fully and decided upon completely, and that when she wrote "I can no longer," she meant precisely and forever exactly that. "You may go and follow her if you wish," he said at last coldly, because coldness was the only armor he had ever been given, and he reached for it now as a drowning man reaches for anything at all. "I will not keep a servant against her inclination." The maid curtsied and turned, and at the door she paused, and though it was not her place, though she risked her character and her reference and everything a woman in her station possessed, she turned back and looked at him. "You never once heard her sing, my lord," she said, "in 11 years. She used to sing in the mornings when she thought no one but me was by. She has the sweetest voice I ever heard on a living soul. And she stopped, years ago now, because the woman's mouth worked, because there was no one who wished to hear it. I only thought you ought to know that, my lord, before she is gone past hearing." And then she was gone too, and Cassian Grenholm was alone in his morning room with a cold cup of coffee and a letter, and the first faint, appalling suspicion that he had, without ever intending it, without ever once meaning harm, thrown away something he had never troubled himself to know he possessed. He did not believe it, not that first day. A man does not unlearn the habits of a lifetime in a single grey morning, and Cassian's whole life had taught him that the world rearranged itself around his wishes and not the other way about. He gave orders. He was very calm and very certain as he gave them. The Duchess had gone to visit relations and had, in a fit of feminine feeling that he did not choose to examine, left a foolish letter. She would be found and reasoned with and brought home, and the whole affair would be forgotten by Michaelmas. He sent a groom to the crossroads to learn which coach she had taken. He sent word to her aunt at Bath, and to her cousin in Shropshire, and to the 2 or 3 houses where a lady of her acquaintance might reasonably go to ground. By evening the groom returned. The Duchess had indeed taken the York mail, paying her own fare in coin from a purse the household did not know she kept, and had descended, the coachman thought, somewhere past the 3rd stage. He could not say precisely where, for she had asked to be set down at a turnpike gate and not at any inn, and had walked off alone across the fields with a single trunk carried behind her by a hired boy, and no one had marked which way she went. Cassian stood at the tall window of his library that night, the letter still in the breast of his coat where he had carried it all day without knowing why, and looked out at the dark shapes of the limes he had passed 10,000 times, and felt the great silent house at his back for the first time as a silence, and not as peace. The first week Cassian told himself he was managing the thing sensibly. He did not raise the household's alarm. He let it be understood, among the few servants who must be told, that the Duchess was gone on a visit, and to the wider world he said nothing at all. And if a certain flatness had come into the great rooms of Grenholm Court, he attributed it to the season, or to his own liver, or to anything but the truth. But the house would not let him keep his fiction. He discovered this by degrees, and each discovery was a small humiliation, and the sum of them a large one. On the 2nd morning the cook came to him, actually came to him, the master, which had never happened in his life, because there was no one else to ask what should be done about the Michaelmas dinner for the tenants, and the flower orders, and the 100 small decisions that had always simply been done, correctly and invisibly, by a hand he had never thought to notice. Her Grace always sees to it, my lord, the cook said, twisting her apron, and Cassian opened his mouth to say, then let it be seen to as usual, and understood, with a slow horror, that the usual way of seeing to it had walked out of his gate at dawn and taken the York mail. He had not known. That was the thing that would not leave him. He had genuinely, entirely not known. He had believed, insofar as he had ever troubled himself to believe anything about the running of his own life, that the smooth, ceaseless comfort of his days was simply the natural order of a duke's existence, the way water runs downhill. He had never once considered that it ran downhill because someone stood at the top of the hill every hour of every day directing it. He walked through his own house that week as a man walks through a country whose language he has never learned. The linen presses, the tenants' accounts, the school she had quietly funded in the village, the widow Marden's pension, the exact hour the great clock must be wound, and by whom, all of it had lived in Evelina's ordering, and none of it had lived in his knowledge. And now it stood about him in silent ruin, not because she had wrecked it, but because she had simply at last put it down. He found her account books in the small writing room that adjoined her apartments, a room he had entered perhaps 3 times in 11 years. He had imagined it, if he had imagined it all, as a place of feminine occupation, embroidery and novels and correspondence with dull relations. It was nothing of the kind. It was the engine room of Grenholm. Ledgers stood ranked upon the shelves in her small even hand, 11 years of them, every expense and every charity and every small mercy set down and accounted, and interleaved among the columns, in the margins, were notes in that same hand that stopped his breath. Widow Marden's roof, see mended before frost, do not tell his Grace, he dislikes to be troubled with tenants. The Coombe boys' schooling, half a year paid, he shows a hand for figures, tell no one, send physic and beef tea to the almshouse Thursdays. On the flyleaf of the newest ledger, dated only a month before, she had written a single line, not to anyone, only to herself. One does what one can, and is glad of the doing, and asks nothing further. He sat down in her small hard chair, a large man in a small room, and read the margins of 11 years, and it was there, on the 4th or 5th day, that the thing at last came home to him, not as grief, which he was not yet capable of, but as a slow and total revision of his own understanding. He had married a fortune and a bloodline and a serviceable, sensible, unremarkable young woman, and he had spent 11 years being served by a woman of profound and unregarded goodness, and he had never once distinguished between the two, because he had never once looked. He wrote to her aunt at Bath. He wrote to the cousin in Shropshire. He wrote at last, swallowing something he had never before been made to swallow, to her father, an elderly, cold, correct old gentleman named Sir Hugh Holloway, who lived retired upon a modest estate in the north and who had, the wedding 11 years before, warned the young Duke in a few dry words that his daughter was worth more than the world would ever tell him, and whom Cassian had smiled at and privately dismissed as a proud old country nobody. Now he wrote to that old man in humble and careful terms, asking whether Evelina had come to him, begging news of her, offering, though it cost him, to come north himself if it would be permitted. The answer, when it came, was 3 lines. My daughter is safe. She is not here. She has asked that her whereabouts be kept from you, and I honor my daughter's asking. When she wishes you to know where she is, she will tell you herself. H. Holloway. Cassian read those 3 cold lines a dozen times and understood from them 2 things that the old man had not troubled to write. The first was that Sir Hugh knew exactly where his daughter was and would sooner have died than tell him. The second was that Evelina, in the very hour of her leaving, had thought clearly enough to protect herself from him, had foreseen that he would write to her father, had foreseen everything, the way a woman foresees a coming winter, and had made her arrangements. She had not fled in a passion. She had withdrawn, calmly and completely, the way a general withdraws an army that has decided the field is not worth the holding, and a man does not follow a withdrawing army with apologies. A man follows it if he follows it at all changed, and by another road and on his knees. He did not yet know that. He knew only that his letters had failed and his grooms had failed, and that the great world, which had bent to his wishes for 42 years, had for the first time in his life simply and quietly declined. It was in the 2nd week that the change in him began, not the great change, that would come slowly and cost him more than he yet imagined, but the first crack in the smooth surface of the man he had always been. It began absurdly, with a horse. He had gone down to the stables in the grey of a wet morning because he could not sit in the house, and the head groom, a taciturn ancient named Fenwick, who had been at Grenholm longer than the Duke himself, was gentling a bay mare in the yard, murmuring to her, and the mare fretted and would not stand. She'll want her grace, Fenwick said, not looking up, not caring for once whether he offended, for he was old and had buried 2 wives and had no fear left in him of anything so small as a duke. This was her grace's mare. Bruised her fetlock at the north hedge back the autumn, and her grace nursed her herself. Every morning, poultice and hand-walking, 6 weeks together. Beast frets for her, beasts know. Cassian stood in the wet and the horse smell and remembered, all at once and against his will, Lord Merrow's careless words at that last dinner. She has a fine seat on a horse. I saw her take the north hedge last autumn, and his own reply, the laughing dismissal, the family plate and restfulness itself, and he understood that he had not even known his own wife had taken that hedge, nor that she had been hurt in the taking, nor that she had healed the mare with her own hands, nor that the horse in front of him, this trembling, grieving animal, had known his wife better than he had. The mare frets for her. Beasts know. He had not known. He put out his hand, and the mare shied from him, from the stranger, and Fenwick made no move to reassure her toward him, and Cassian let his hand fall and stood a moment longer in the rain, and then walked back to the house, and it was the first morning of his life on which he had felt small. That was the beginning. After that the discoveries came faster, each one a mirror held up to a face he did not wish to see. He learned from the vicar, who called to inquire delicately after her grace, that his wife had for 11 years knelt at the bedsides of the dying in the village, that she had read to old blind Mrs. Sartell every Tuesday of her life, that the Sunday school was hers, the almshouse coal was hers, that the poor of 2 parishes called her by her Christian name in their prayers, and had already begun to ask, in frightened whispers, whether the good Duchess was ill, was dying, was gone. He learned from his own steward that she had privately made up, out of her own settlement money, the shortfall in 3 tenants' rents through the bad harvest 2 years past, so that no family should be turned out, and had made the steward swear to keep it from his grace. "'Cause his grace," she had said, and the steward reddened as he repeated it, did not like to be troubled with such things, did not like to be troubled. He heard the phrase again and again that fortnight, from servant after servant, tenant after tenant, always the same words, always her words. The shield she had built around him so that he might go on being the man he was, untroubled, ungrieved, unbothered and unaware, while she carried, silently and alone, the whole living weight of what it meant to be good in the place where she stood. She had not left him because he was cruel. She had left him because she had at last understood that no amount of her goodness would ever make him look at her, and that a woman may bear being unloved for a long time, but she cannot bear being unseen forever, and be less than dead. He shut himself in his library on the 15th night with decanter he did not touch, and he wrote her name upon a sheet of paper, Evelina. Only that, the first time in his life he could remember writing it, and he looked at it a long while. And then, because he was still, for all his dawning shame, a proud man and a duke and unpracticed in the whole grammar of humility, he did the wrong thing. He resolved to find her. Not to change, he did not yet understand that changing was the whole and only task, but to find her and to bring her home, and to set things right by force of will and rank and money, as he had set right everything else in his life. He would hire men. He would spare no expense. He would run her to earth, wherever her stubborn father had hidden her, and he would stand before her and say, he did not quite know what he would say, but it would be sufficient, it would be ducal, it would suffice. He did not yet know that a woman who has walked away with dignity cannot be brought back by an army, and that the only thing on earth that could ever fetch Evelina Halley home again was a man she did not yet believe existed, a Cassian Grenholm who had learned to see. He hired a man from London, a discreet, clever, expensive man named Sowerby who found things and people for gentlemen who could pay, and asked no questions and answered few. Sowerby heard the Duke's terms and named his own, and set to work. And within a fortnight had done what the grooms and the letters could not. He had traced the York mail and the turnpike gate, and a hired boy who remembered carrying a lady's trunk, and a carrier who had taken a quiet gentlewoman some 3 days' journey further north, to a small country town called Harrowgill on the edge of the moors, where, Sowerby reported, laying the paper on the Duke's desk with the neat pride of a workman, a lady answering to the Duchess's description had taken modest lodgings above a bookseller's shop, under the name of Mrs. Hartley, and given out that she was a widow come to the country for her health. Mrs. Hartley, not even her own name. She had put down being a duchess as easily as another woman puts down a shawl, and had walked into a strange town and invented a plain widow to be, and Sowerby noted, because Sowerby noted everything, had within a week made herself so well liked in that small place that the bookseller's wife spoke of her as though she had lived there a lifetime, and the poor of the town, who had a nose for such things, had already begun to find their way to her door. Cassian read this, and his first feeling was triumph, the hot, swift triumph of the hunter who has found his quarry. He would go north at once. He would arrive at Harrowgill in his own carriage, with his own arms upon the door, and he would climb those booksellers' stairs and stand before her, and end this foolishness, and by the week's end she would be home where she belonged, at the foot of his table, and the world would be right again. He got as far as ordering the horses. He got as far as the packed trunk and the travelling cloak and the carriage brought round to the door in the raw dawn. And then he stood on the steps of Grenholm Court, one gloved hand on the cold carriage door, and something stopped him, not conscience exactly, for his conscience was still a half-grown thing, but a kind of dreadful clarity, a vision so sharp and so unwanted that it froze him where he stood. He saw himself arriving. He saw the ducal carriage in mean little northern street, the whole town gaping. He saw himself climbing the narrow stairs, filling the small doorway of her small brave rooms, the great Duke of Grenholm come to collect his straying wife, and he saw her face. He saw it exactly, because he had at last, too late, begun to know her face, the composure of it, perfect grave stillness, the small correct curtsy she would make him even there, even then, in her own borrowed room, and he heard, in his mind's ear, the only words she could possibly say to such an arrival, which were the same words her letter had already said, "I ask only that you leave me to do the same." He would not be bringing her home. He would only be proving one last time and forever that he had understood nothing, that he still believed she was a thing to be fetched, a possession mislaid and recovered, a duchess who had wandered off her mark. He would be standing in her doorway as living proof that he had not changed at all. And she would look at him with those quiet eyes, and she would refuse him with perfect gentleness, and he would have to turn his great ducal carriage around in that mean little street and drive the length of England home, having taught her only that she had been right to go. Cassian took his hand off the carriage door. He stood a long moment in the cold. Then he said to his coachman, in a voice that surprised him by its unsteadiness, "Take them out. We do not go." He went back into the silent house, and he did not order the carriage again, and it was on that morning, the morning he did not go to Harrogil, that the true change in him began, for he understood, standing in his empty hall, that he could not win her by finding her. He had already found her. Finding was nothing. The problem was not that Evelina was lost. The problem was that Cassian was not worth returning to, and that no journey, however long, could carry a man to a place he had not first become worthy to arrive at. And so he did a thing that no one who had known him would have believed. He stayed. He stayed, and he began, clumsily, secretly ashamed of himself and unpracticed in every part of it, to learn the running of his own house and lands and people from the ground up, as though he were a green hare and not a Duke of 42. He took down his wife's ledgers, and he read them until he understood them, and then he took them to his steward and asked to be taught, and the steward, a decent man named Pallister, who had served the family 30 years, and never once been asked a question by its master, went home that night and told his wife that he thought the world was ending, for the Duke of Grenholm had said please to him and had listened. Cassian rode out to the tenants, not on the great hunter with the grooms behind him, but alone, on Evelina's bay mare, who suffered him now a little, because he came every morning with an apple in his pocket, and sat with her in the dark of the stable and talked to her as he had never in his life talked to a living thing. He rode to the farms he had passed 1,000 times and never entered. He sat in low smoky kitchens on hard settles and drank bad tea and listened, actually listened, to men and women whose names he was ashamed to be learning for the first time, and heard from them, without their ever meaning to tell him, the whole shape of the woman he had lost. Her Grace stood godmother to my youngest, sir. Her Grace sent her own physician when the fever came and paid him, and never a word to trouble you with it. Her Grace held my mother's hand the night she died, sir, and sang to her low, so the pain should be less. Sang the whole night she did, and never told a soul. Sang. There it was again, the singing he had never heard, the voice Datchet had wept over, offered to strangers and the dying in the dark, and never once to him, because he had never once been the sort of man in whose presence a woman would sing. He learned the widow Marden's name, and mended her roof again where the winter had opened it, and did it himself, or nearly, standing on the ladder in his shirt-sleeves with the tenant's son passing up the slates, and the whole village agog below, until it was done. And the old woman wept and did not know why the great Duke was on her roof, and Cassian, coming down the ladder with his hands torn and his fine coat forgotten in the hedge, felt for the first time in his life the small, clean pleasure of having done a thing that mattered to someone, done it himself, unwatched by any world that would applaud him for it. Evelina had known that pleasure every day for 11 years. One does what one can, and is glad of the doing, and asks nothing further. He had read the line in her ledger, and thought it merely pious. Now he began, dimly, to understand that it had been the truest description of a happy life he had ever encountered, and that he had lived beside a person who possessed the secret of happiness, and had never thought to ask her what it was. The village school she had founded had faltered in her absence. The young schoolmistress she had engaged was owed 3/4 wages that no one now knew how to authorize, and had begun quietly to pack her boxes to go. Cassian rode to the school. He had never been inside it. It was a low, whitewashed room with a peat fire and 24 children of his tenants, and above the master's desk, framed in Evelina's hand, hung a single sentence she had evidently set the children to copy for their fair hand. A person is not made great by their birth, but by their kindness. He stood in the doorway and read it, and his eyes stung, and the schoolmistress, not knowing him, curtsied and asked was he the man come about the coals. He paid her wages out of his own purse on the spot. and a year in advance, and endowed the school so that it should never want again, and rode home and told no one, because he had begun at last to understand her, to understand that a good deed loses half its goodness the moment it is done to be seen. The county noticed his changing, of course, for the county noticed everything, and it did not know what to make of it. The Duke of Grenholm no longer dined out. He had let it be known, through no words of his own but by the loud eloquence of an empty guest book, that the great dinners at Grenholm Court were at an end. The men who had laughed at his table found no more tables to laugh at. The fine ladies who had wished their names spoken in his rooms found the rooms shut up and dark. It was put about that the Duchess was ill, and then that she was travelling, and then, the truth being unstoppable, that she was gone, that there had been some quarrel, some cruelty, that plain, restful, forgettable little Duchess of Grenholm had, of all the astonishing things, up and left the great Duke, and that he moped about his estate like a man half dead. Lord Merrow came once, all bluff good fellowship, to rally him back to the world, to remind him of the hunting, the port, the old easy life. He found the Duke in his shirt-sleeves in the estate office, with a tenant's ditching account spread before him, and did not know his friend. "Good God, Grenholm," he said, "you've gone quite eremitical. It was only a joke, you know, that night. The thing you said about her being plain. Every man says such things of his wife. She took it too much to heart, that's the whole of it. Fetch her home and give her a diamond and let us all forget it." Cassian looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been his friend, whose laughter he had fed on for years, and saw in him with sudden and merciless clarity the man he himself had been not 2 months before. "It was not a joke, Merrow," he said quietly. "I meant every word of it, which is the shame of it, and I meant it easily, which is the worse shame, and she did not take it too much to heart. She took it exactly as much to heart as it deserved, which is to say entirely, and then she did the one dignified thing that was left to her, which was to remove her heart from a place where it was not wanted. I do not blame her. I blame the man who sat at the head of that table, and I am attempting, rather late, to be less of him." He turned back to the ditching accounts. "You will forgive me. I am learning what a French drain is, and I find I mind it more than the hunting." Merrow went away and told everyone the Duke had run mad, and in a sense he had, mad in the old and better meaning, changed clean out of himself, unmade and being slowly, painfully, remained the absence of a woman he had never troubled to see while she sat, patient and unregarded, 3 feet from his careless hand. There were nights, through that first strange autumn of his changing, when the old man came back to him, the man he had been, and stood at the foot of his bed in the dark and argued. It was easy, that man whispered, easy and reasonable and warm. "Why torment yourself so? A duke does not shovel snow. A duke does not sit up with dying weavers. You have played at penance long enough to satisfy your conscience. Now send Sowerby's men and fetch her. Buy her a house in town if she likes her freedom. Keep a mistress of your own dignity, and let the county see you unbowed. She left. That is a woman's affair. A man of your rank does not crawl." And Cassian would lie in the dark and listen to that voice, which was his own voice, which had been the voice of his whole life, and he would understand with a cold clarity that everything it said was the truth of the world he had been born into. And not one word of it was the truth of the world Evelina had shown him by leaving, and each night, with a labour that never grew easier, he chose against it. He was not a naturally humble man. Humility did not descend upon him like grace. He had to build it, board by board, over the pit of his own pride every single day, and some days he built badly and had to tear it down and start again. But he built. He learned things about himself in that building that shamed him and, slowly, freed him. He learned that he had never in his life said the words "I was wrong" aloud to another human being, and that the first time he said them, to his steward Pallister, over a matter of a tenant's drainage he had ruled on wrongly out of ignorance, the words came out of him rusty and cracked, like a gate unopened for 40 years, and that Pallister looked at him afterward with something that was not contempt, as Cassian had feared, but the beginning of respect. And that the respect of a good plain man honestly earned was worth more than all the flattery that had ever crossed his table. He learned that he had confused his whole life, being feared with being esteemed, and being obeyed with being loved, and that these were not merely different things but opposite things, and that he had spent 42 years collecting the wrong one and calling himself rich. The winter closed in over Grenholm, and he did not go south to town for the season, as he had every year of his life, and the failure of the Duke of Grenholm to appear in London set the drawing-rooms buzzing. It was said he had lost his mind. It was said he had lost his fortune. It was said, with the particular relish reserved for the fall of the proud, that his dull little duchess had run off with a music-master, or a groom, or a highwayman, each version more absurd than the last. Cassian heard the echoes of them come north with the visitors and the newspapers, and let them pass over him like weather. He found, to his own surprise, that he did not care what the drawing-rooms said. He had spent his life performing for exactly those rooms. The whole cruelty at his own table had been a performance for exactly those rooms, and now that he had stopped performing, he could not for his life remember why the applause had ever seemed worth having. One caller he did receive. In the deep of that winter was the vicar, Mr. Ellery, a mild, scholarly old man who had christened and buried in the 2 parishes for 30 years and who came, ostensibly, about the endowment of the school, but truly, Cassian understood, to take the measure of the changed Duke for himself. They sat a long evening by the library fire, and the vicar, who was no fool and had known Evelena's true worth for years and grieved her going more than he said, asked at last, gently, the question he had come to ask. "Do you love her, my lord? Forgive an old man the impertinence. But I have watched what you have done these months, the roofs, the school, the sitting up, the whole quiet labour of it, and I confess it puzzles me, for it is not the behaviour of a man merely sorry, nor of a man merely proud and stung, so I ask plainly. Is it love, or is it only remorse very finely dressed?" Cassian was quiet a while, watching the fire, for he had asked himself the same question in the dark, and not been sure of the answer, and he would not lie to a good man about a thing so grave. "I do not know that I have the right to the word yet," he said at last. "I think I loved her the whole time and never knew it, the way a man can own a great painting and hang it in a dark passage, and pass it 1,000 times unseeing and only understand what he had when it is stolen. I know that I would give the whole of Grenholm to undo one evening. I know that I cannot pass the foot of my own table without my chest closing. I know that I ride her mare because it is the only creature left in this house that loved her openly, and that I talk to it about her like a madman. If that is love, then I love her past all bearing and have for years, and was too great a fool to feel it while feeling it might have done some good. But I will not stand up in front of you, Mr. Ellery, or in front of her, and call it love and claim the credit of the word, for a man does not deserve the credit of a love he only discovers by wrecking it. I will let the word alone until I have earned it. I will only do the things love does, quietly, and let her decide, if she ever will, what to call them." The old vicar looked at him a long moment in the firelight, and then he said softly, "That, my lord, if you will permit me, that is the most nearly loving thing I have heard a man say in 40 years of hearing men speak of love. Most men are eager to claim the word and slow to do the deeds. You have inverted it. I think you may be further along than you know." And he took his leave and went home through the snow, and told his housekeeper that he had witnessed a resurrection that winter, of a rarer kind than Scripture generally furnished, and that he intended to pray for its completion. Sowerby all this while kept his watch on Harrowgill and sent his neat reports, and Cassian read them the way a starving man reads a letter about a feast he may not attend. Mrs. Hartley was well. Mrs. Hartley had taught 3 cottage children their letters at her own fireside. Mrs. Hartley had refused, gently, the addresses of the town's respectable widowed apothecary, who had been much struck by her, and had let it be known that she was not free to marry, though she gave no reasons, and Cassian, reading that line, sat very still for a long time, for it was the first evidence he had that she still, in some corner of herself, held to the fact of him, and he did not know whether to take comfort from it or shame, and took, in the end, both. He kept, too, the discipline of the unsent letters, all through the deepening winter, and the stack in her writing table grew. He wrote the vicar's visit and the question about love, and the answer he had given. He wrote of the night the old voice came to his bedside and he chose against it, and of how the choosing did not grow easier. He wrote once in the small hours after a particularly bad tenant's death, a young mother, gone of the same low fever, leaving a husband stunned and mute. of the whole terrible vividness with which he had understood, kneeling in that cottage, that he might so easily have lost Evelina to just such a fever in just such a cottage, unseen and unmourned by him, dead as Mrs. Hartley, the widow, with her true name never spoken, and he the last to know. That letter he could barely finish, and having finished it he sat with his head on her writing table among her ledgers until the candle guttered. And it was that letter, though he did not know it as he sealed it away, that Sir Hugh's kindly fetched trunk of linen would carry north, and that Evelina would read 3 times over by her own fire, weeping, unable to tell even Datchet why. For it was true, all of it, and she was reading it. That was the mercy hidden in the whole long grief of that winter, working itself out unseen at both ends of England. That while Cassian laboured in the dark, to become a man worthy of asking, the record of his labour had already travelled ahead of him and lain down quietly beside the woman he could not reach, and spoke for him in his own hand, at the one hour and in the one voice she might, at last, be willing to believe. He did not know it. He built his humility board by board over the pit of his pride and thought himself unheard, writing into silence, doing kindnesses no one witnessed. And all the while, 3 days' journey north, a thin recovering woman by a small fire was learning, letter by letter, that the impossible thing had happened, that the man who had never once looked at her had at last, alone and unwatched and asking nothing, learned how to see. The true test of his changing, before ever the fever carried him north, came in the person of a tenant named Job Aldous, and Cassian would count it afterward among the small hinges on which his whole remaking had turned. Aldous held a hard hill farm on the far edge of the estate, poor land, and had fallen 2 years behind in his rent through no fault of his own, but 3 wet harvests running, and had been, under the old dispensation, marked for eviction at Lady Day. The notice had gone out over the steward's signature months before Evelina left, in the ordinary machinery of the estate, and Cassian had never so much as heard the man's name. He heard it now because Aldous came to the great house himself, cap in hand, grey-faced, to plead for his family, and by some accident of the changed household was shown not to the steward but to the Duke. The old Cassian would not have received him at all. A duke did not hear tenants. That was what a steward was for. The old Cassian, had the matter somehow reached him, would have ruled by the ledger. 2 years behind was 2 years behind. The land must pay. Sentiment was ruinous. Let the man go and a solvent tenant take the farm. He felt all of that rising in him now, the whole cold arithmetic of his class, as Job Aldous stood twisting his cap on the library carpet and stammering out his case. And then Cassian actually looked in the new way he was painfully learning, at the man before him, at the cracked hands, and the fear in the face, and the boots mended past mending, and he thought of the margin in Evelina's ledger, the one he had found on the 4th day, made up 3 tenants' rents from her own settlement, so that no family should be turned out, tell no one. And he understood that this was one of them, or would have been, that this was precisely the kind of quiet catastrophe his wife had spent 11 years silently averting 3 feet from his unseeing hand. "Sit down, Mr. Aldous," he said, and the man startled as though struck, for no tenant of Grenholm had ever been asked to sit in that library in living memory. "Sit down and tell me the whole of it, slowly, and leave nothing out." He heard the whole of it. It took an hour, and it was a hard hour, for the man wept before the end, and Cassian, who had never in his life sat in a room with a weeping man of the lower orders and been made to feel it, felt it all the way down. And when it was told he did not rule by the ledger, he forgave the arrears. The whole 2 years struck clean off, and he abated the rent on that poor hill land to a figure it could actually bear in a wet county. And then, because he was learning that charity which merely relieves and does not restore is only pride in a softer coat, he sat another hour with Aldous over a map of the farm and worked out, the 2 of them together, master and tenant bent over the same paper, a scheme of draining the sour upper field that might, in a few years, make the holding pay honestly and leave the man his self-respect, which Cassian was coming to understand was worth more to a poor man than any handout, and was the one form of help the rich most rarely troubled to give. Aldous went home not knowing what had happened to him, and told his wife the Duke had run mad, which was the general verdict of the county that season, and the 2 of them sat up late marvelling, and did not sleep for the strangeness of being, after 2 years of dread, suddenly and inexplicably safe. Cassian, for his part, sat long in the library after the man had gone, and understood that he had just done, unwitnessed, a thing that would appear in no drawing room, earn him no applause, and cost him a good deal of money for no return the world could measure, and that he had enjoyed it more than any triumph of his old life, more than any run of luck at cards or any deference at any table. He took down Evelina's ledger and turned to the margin about the 3 tenants, and beside it, in his own hand, he wrote the date and aldus. Arrears forgiven. Rent abated, upper field to be drained, and understood at last, too late, why she did this, and asks her pardon for the 11 years he let her do it alone. It was another letter he would never send and she would one day read, but more than that. It was the first entry he had ever made in the great book of quiet goodness his wife had been keeping single-handed for 11 years, and making it, he felt, absurdly, as though he had at last been admitted on probation at the very bottom, unfit and grateful, to a company he had not known existed and now wanted, above all the honours of his rank, to be worthy to belong to. The word of it spread, as such words do, faster and further than any of his charities had been meant to travel, for the poor keep their own intelligence and it runs quick and true. By midwinter there was a second story going about the county alongside the story of the Duke gone mad, and the second story was told in cottages and not in drawing rooms, and was, in the end, the only one that mattered. It was said on the far hill farms and in the almshouse and at the school and along the frozen lanes that the great cold Duke of Grenholm had turned kind, that he mended roofs with his own hands and forgave desperate men their debts, and sat up with the dying and asked to be taught by his own steward, and that it had all begun the morning his good Duchess left him, as though her going had cracked some long frozen thing in him and let out, lost, the man she must have seen in there all along, buried under 40 years of ice, when no one else could see him at all. The poor, who had loved Evelina, took a fierce private satisfaction in this, and prayed in their plain way at their own hearths that the Duchess would come home to see what her leaving had wrought, for they understood, as the fine world never did, that she had not run off in a pet but had, by the sheer terrible dignity of her going, accomplished the one thing 11 years of gentle presence had not. She had made him look. And Cassian, had he known that the poor of his own estate were praying for his marriage at their firesides, would have wept, for he was coming to hold their good opinion dearer than any he had ever courted, and did not yet feel he had earned it, and was not sure he ever would. He knew only that the great house was less empty than it had been, though she was still gone from it, because it was filling, room by room, with a purpose it had never held before, and that when at last the news came north from Sowerby that she lay ill among strangers, and he flung himself onto the black midnight road, he went not as the man who had sat blind at the head of that table, but as something new and unfinished and painfully alive, a work but half built over the old pit himself, carrying north whatever he had managed so far to become, to lay it, such as it was, at the feet of the woman who had, without ever meaning to, and only by refusing at last to disappear, given him back his soul. Autumn deepened into the first hard frosts, and Cassian did not go to Harrowgill, though he thought of it every day, and though he now knew the exact stairs he might climb. He had understood that he must not go as the Duke, must not go to fetch or to command or to buy her back, but he had not yet understood what he might go as instead, and so he waited and worked and changed and let the changing be its own long apprenticeship. Only once a week he allowed himself one small indulgence. He wrote to her. He did not send the letters. That was the discipline he set himself, and it was harder than any fast. Every Sunday evening he sat in the library and wrote to Evelina, not the letters a duke writes to summon back a wife, but the letters a man writes when he has begun to learn who he is. He told her what he had done that week, plainly without excuse. I mended the widow Marden's roof and did it ill, and she wept, and I did not understand at first that the weeping was because no one had ever climbed a roof for her before. You have been climbing roofs for these people for 11 years. I never knew. He told her of the school, and the sentence in her hand above the master's desk, and how it undone him. He told her of the mayor, who fretted for her still, and suffered him now only a little, and was right too. I have learned, he wrote in one of them, that you were the best part of my life, and that I spent it, and that a man cannot unspend a thing. I do not write to ask you to come back. I have no right to ask it, and I begin to think it would be a wrong to ask it. I write only because I find I would rather speak to you and not be heard than be as I was before, and speak to no one and think myself content. He sealed each letter and did not send it, and put it in the drawer of her small writing table in the engine room of Grenholm, among her ledgers where it belonged, and the stack of them grew through the autumn, a fat quiet monument to a conversation he had begun 11 years too late. It was Sowerby, the London man, who broke the discipline. Sowerby, who was still at the Duke's monthly retainer, keeping a quiet watch upon Harrowgill and send his neat dry reports. In the third month one of these reports carried news that made Cassian rise from his chair before he had finished reading it. The Duchess, Mrs. Hartley, had fallen ill. A fever had come to the town off the moors, the same low autumn fever that emptied cottages, and she had, it seemed, done exactly what she had always done. She had gone into the sick houses to nurse where no one else would go, and had nursed until she herself was taken with it, and now lay ill in her rooms above the booksellers, tended only by her old maid Datchet and by the bookseller's kindly wife. With the town physician doubtful and the weather turning, and the coach roads north ready half closed, with the first true snow of the year, Cassian read it twice. Then he was out of the room and shouting for horses, for the travelling chaise, for his warmest things, and there was no vision now of ducal carriages and mean streets and correct refusals to stay his hand. There was only the single roaring fact that Evelina was ill, and far and among strangers, and that he would go to her if he had to walk. He went out into the yard bareheaded into the falling snow, and Fenwick the old groom, seeing the master's face, harnessed the fastest team without a word and made the second fastest ready to follow with the maid Datchet's replacement, and every remedy the still room held. And by full dark the Duke of Grenholm was on the north road, alone in the plunging chaise, with the snow coming sidelong out of the black, and the miles unwinding with a terrible slowness, and his whole life narrowed to a single prayer that he'd not know he knew the words to, and had certainly never before had cause to say. The journey was 3 days. It ought to have been 2, but the snow had shut the high passes, and twice the chaise was dug out of drifts by lantern light with the post-boys cursing and Cassian himself at the shovel in his shirt-sleeves, careless of everything but the losing of hours. And once they were forced to lie a whole precious night at a wretched inn while the storm screamed over the moor, and Cassian sat awake before the tap-room fire with his hands opening and closing, and every dark hour laying a fresh weight upon him. What if he came too late? What if the last word of hers he should ever have was "my lord," and the last thing she should ever know of him was the empty chair 3 feet away that he had never once turned toward her? He had thought these 3 months that his punishment was to have lost her to another town. He understood now in that shrieking inn that he had not begun to imagine what loss could be, that there was a country beyond this one, past even Harrowgill, from which no changed man could fetch her back with anything at all. On the second night of the northward road, storm-bound at the wretched moorland inn while the snow screamed over the roof, Cassian could not sleep, and would not have if he could, and sat instead the whole black night before the guttering tap-room fire with Sowerby's reports spread on his knee, reading by firelight everything the London man's patient watch had gathered of the life his wife had built without him. He read it the way a man reads the record of a country he has been exiled from, with longing and with shame, and slowly, through the long roaring hours, the report stopped being intelligence and became a portrait, and the portrait broke his heart and mended it in the same stroke. He read that she had come to Harrowgill with a single trunk and had taken the meanest respectable lodging in the town, 2 rooms above the booksellers, and had not once, in all the months of Sowerby's watching, spent a penny on herself beyond the barest need. She who had had the whole revenue of a duchy to command, and had commanded it, he now knew, almost entirely for others. He read that within a fortnight of her coming, the town had somehow discovered, though she had told no one, that the quiet widow Hartley had a gift for the sick and a bottomless patience with the poor, and had begun to bring its griefs to her door. The woman whose husband drank, the girl carrying a child and no ring, the old weaver dying alone, the child who could not learn his letters. And she had taken them all in, one after another, with nothing now to give but to herself, no settlement money, no ducal purse, only her hands and her time and that low, sweet voice, And Sowerby, who was a hard man and dealt in facts, had written, in one report, a sentence that did not read like Sowerby at all. The people of this town have come to regard Mrs. Hartley as something between a sister and a saint, and I confess I do not fully understand it, for she does nothing remarkable, only she is never too busy, and never turns a soul away, and looks at each one as though there were no other person in the world, as though there were no other person in the world. Cassian read that line at 3 in the morning with the storm tearing at the inn, and put the paper down and covered his face, for that was the very thing, the whole of it, the single thing she had wanted from him and never once received across 11 years, and the length of a silver-laden table. To be looked at as though there were no other person in the world. She had starved for it in his house and gone out into poverty and found she could not live without giving to strangers the very bread she herself had been denied. And the strangers had known at once what he had never seen in 11 years, that here was a rare and precious soul, and had loved her for it inside a fortnight, while he had lived beside her for over a decade and reached, at his own table, for the word plain. He understood, in that shrieking dark, the full and exact size of what he had done, and it was larger than he had let himself know. He had not merely failed to love a good woman, he had taken a soul whose whole nature was to pour itself out in attention upon others, and had placed it in a house where its every offering was received without acknowledgment, year on year, like water poured into sand, and had thereby taught her, slowly, the cruelest lesson a generous heart can learn, which is that its gifts are worthless, that its love is a nuisance, that it had better fold itself small and quiet and expect nothing, and she had very nearly believed it, had been on the point of vanishing even to herself, when she gathered the last of her courage and walked out his gate to save the only life she had. And in a strange poor town, among people who had never heard the word Duchess, she had bloomed within a fortnight into exactly what she had always been and been forbidden to be, and the whole town had seen it at once, because the whole town had done the one thing he never had. They had looked at her. He resolved, somewhere in the worst of that night, with the fire nearly out and the storm at its height and his wife lying ill 3 hard stages further north, that if she lived, if only she lived, he would spend whatever remained of his life being to her what the town of Harrogel had been within a fortnight, someone who looked at her as though there were no other person in the world, not because it would win her, he had put winning aside, because she deserved it, and had always deserved it, and had gone without it for 11 years in his keeping, and a man who has starved a garden owes it, at the very least, water, whether or not the garden ever consents to bloom for him again, and if she did not live, his mind flinched from it, and made itself go on, for he had learned that a man must look even at the things he cannot bear. If she did not live, then he would go on doing it anyway, in her name, in the villages, for the poor she had loved, until he followed her, for he had discovered that the habit of true kindness, once truly begun, is not a debt one pays and closes, but a country one enters and does not leave, and that Evelina had shown him its border, and left the gate ajar, and that whether or not she was ever again on the other side of it to see him, he meant to live out his days on the far side of that gate, where she had always lived, because it was the only ground on which a man could stand and be worth the standing. The fire went out at last. The storm eased toward dawn. Cassian gathered Sowerby's papers with hands that were steadier now, though his eyes burned, and went out into the grey to rouse the postboys and the horses, for the road was passable again, and there were still 2 stages to Harrogel, and every hour was a stone upon his chest. He did not know. Climbing into the cold chaise with the first thin light breaking over the white moor, whether he would find her living or dead, forgiving or lost to him forever. He knew only which side of the gate he meant to be found on when he arrived, and that the woman who had shown it to him was, whatever became of the 2 of them, the greatest and best thing that had ever entered his careless and fortunate and finally, mercifully, broken life. And he set his face to the north and prayed the only prayer he knew, which was her name, and drove on into the morning. He came into Harrogel on the 3rd afternoon. The snow ceased at last, and the little town white and silent under it, smoke standing straight from the chimneys into a hard blue cold. He did not ask directions to the booksellers. He knew them. Sowerby's neat reports had drawn him the whole town. He left the chaise in the square and went up the narrow street on foot, a tall, snow-caked stranger, and found the shop with the bow window and the low door beside it, and climbed the dark stair with his heart going like a hammer, and at the top he'd not knock. He could not have made his hand knock. He stood outside the door of the small rooms where his wife lay ill, the Duke of Grenholm, who had never in his life been made to wait for anything, and he waited, shaking, until the door opened from within and Datchet stood there, grey with exhaustion, a basin in her hands, and saw him and went white, and then, wonderfully, did not send him away. "She's living, my lord," the old maid said low, before he could speak, and the word living went through him like warmth through frozen limbs. The fever broke in the night. "She's weak as water, and she'll not be right for weeks, but she's living, and she'll know you." Then, because she was old and had earned the right, she looked at him hard. "Have you come to fetch her, my lord? For I'll tell you now, plain, before you cross that door, if you've come to fetch her, turn round and go back down these stairs, and God speed you home, and never come again. She's near died being who she truly is, my lord, at last free of that great cold house and the whole weight of you, and I'll not have her fetched back to sit at the foot of your table and be your amusement. If that's your errand, go." Cassian looked at the old woman, and he did not draw himself up, and he did not remember that he was a duke. "It is not my errand," he said. "I have not come to fetch her, Datchet. I have come to sit with her, if she will have me, and to nurse her if she will suffer it, and to ask nothing else of her at all. And if she bids me go, I will go, and I will not come again unless she sends for me. But I could not stay away while she was ill among strangers. Even a man as poor as I am could not do that." He drew a breath. "May I see her? Only to know she lives. Then I will do whatever she wishes." The old maid searched his face a long moment, in the cold of that little landing, and something in it must have been new, must have been true, for she stood aside. "She's sleeping," she whispered. "Go soft." "And my lord," she caught his sleeve as he passed, and her voice broke. "She has your letters. All of them. The ones you never sent. Her father had them fetched from her writing table when he sent her Lenanon, not knowing what they were, and she found them among it a month past, and she has read them, my lord. Every one. I have watched her read them by the fire a dozen times over, and weep, and not tell me why. So do not think when you go in that she does not know your heart. She knows it better than you do. The only thing she does not know is whether to believe it." And Cassian, who had written those letters into silence and sealed them, and never dreamed a living soul would read them, stood on the dark landing above the bookseller's shop and understood that the whole long private labour of his changing had, by some accident of an old man's kindness and a fetched trunk of linen, walked 3 days ahead him up the north road and lain all this while by his wife's sickbed. Speaking for him better than he could ever speak for himself, he put his hand to the doorframe to steady himself. Then he went softly. The room was small and clean and poor, and the winter light lay pale across a narrow bed, and there she was. He had thought, in 3 days of terror, of 100 versions of her, but he had not thought of this. How small she looked, how thin the fever had worn her, and yet how the plainness he had once named at his own table had, in this bare white light, become something he had no word for. Some fineness of bone and stillness of feature that he had looked past for 11 years, because he had been too great a fool to see that the quiet of her face was not the absence of anything, but the presence of everything he lacked. Her hair, unbound, was spread dark on the pillow, threaded now with a little grey he had never noticed coming. Her hands lay upon the coverlet, thin and worn with work, the hands that had mended roofs and held the dying, and beside them on the counterpane, tied with a bit of ribbon, lay a bundle of letters in his own hand. He knelt down below bed, because there was no chair and because kneeling was, he found, the only posture his body would consent to, and he did not wake her. He only knelt there in his travel-stained clothes and looked at his wife and let the tears come silently, as he had not let them come since he was a boy, for he had spent his whole adult life untroubled, and had at last been troubled all the way down to the ground of him, and it was, he understood even through the grief of it, the best thing that had ever happened to him. She woke slowly. He felt her wake before he saw it, a change in the rhythm of her breath, and he stayed very still, kneeling, not to startle her, and her eyes opened, unfocused with weakness, and found the shape of a man kneeling at her bed, and for a moment there was no recognition in them, only the mild wonder of the very ill. Then they cleared and she knew him, and Cashin watched a whole succession of things cross her face. Surprise and a flinching that cut him to the bone, and then, mastering all of it, that grave composure he knew so well. The composure with which she had curtsied to him at his own table on the last night of his old life. "My lord," she said. Her voice was a thread of what it had been, but it was steady, and it was cool, and it put him at once at the proper distance. "You are a long way from Grenholm." "Yes," he said. He did not rise. He did not reach for a hand, though it lay a foot from his own, and he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. "I heard you were ill. I came to sit with you, if you will let me, and to be of use if I can, and for nothing else. Datchet has my word on it, and now you have it too. I have not come to fetch you home, Evelina. I understand now that I cannot, and that I ought not, and that if I tried I should only prove I had learned nothing." He looked down at his own hands. "I am only very glad you are living. I did not know, until I feared to lose you altogether, how glad." She was quiet a moment. Her eyes moved from his face to the bundle of letters on the coverlet and back, and he saw that she knew she had read them, and that neither of them was going to be able to pretend otherwise. And that this was, in its way, a mercy, that the thing was out between them and could not be taken back, and must therefore be dealt with honestly or not at all. "You wrote me letters you never sent," she said. "Yes. Why did you not send them?" He considered how to answer, and understood that only the truth would do, that he was in a country now where nothing but the truth had any currency at all. "Because a letter sent is a letter that asks for something," he said slowly. "It asks to be answered. It asks to be forgiven, or at least considered, and I had no right to ask you for anything, Evelina. I had spent every right I ever had. So I wrote them for myself, to become someone who could have written them honestly, and I put them in your writing table because it seemed to me they belonged there more than anywhere in the world, among your ledgers, in the one room in that whole great house where anything true was ever done. I never dreamed you would read them. His voice caught. "I am sorry that you did, not because I did not mean them, because they must have troubled a piece you had earned, and I had promised myself I would not trouble you again." The pale winter light moved on the wall. Somewhere below, a shop bell rang and a cart went by in the snow-muffled street, and the small clock on the mantel ticked, a different clock in a different room from the one that had ticked on the morning she left, and yet the same appalling patient sound. "You have changed," Evelina said at last. It was not a concession. It was an observation, careful and unwilling, the observation of a woman who has been hurt too deeply to let herself hope carelessly. "Or you have learned to write as though you had." "I have read your letters a great many times, my lord, and I have not been able to decide which it is. That is why I did not send for you when I might have. I did not know whether the man in the letters was real, or only the newest thing a clever, proud man had found to want." "That is a fair fear," he said. "It is the fear I should have, in your place. I cannot argue you out of it, and I will not try, for arguing you out of it would be exactly the old sin. Cashin Grenholm deciding what you ought to feel and expecting the world to arrange itself around it. I can only be here and be of use and let you watch for as long as you can bear to have me watched, and at the end of it you will believe me or you will not, and either way I will abide by it." He drew a breath. "But I will tell you one thing, Evelina, because it is true and because you have the right to it. I did not change in order to win you back. I want to be very exact about that, because it matters. I began to change before I knew where you were, and I went on changing after I knew and did not come. And I would have gone on changing for the rest of my life, whether or not I ever saw you again, because you left a light on in that house, in 100 small rooms and roofs and account books, and I walked into the light of it after you were gone. And I could not walk back out of it into the dark and be the man I was. You did not only leave me, you showed me, by leaving, everything you had been doing in the light while I sat in the dark and called it comfort. I owe you that whether you ever forgive me or not. I would owe it to you if you married another man tomorrow. That is the part that is real, and I think it is the only part you can safely believe. Not that I love you. You have every reason to doubt that, but that you made me better by being what you were, and that the debt does not depend on your forgiveness, and I will be paying it, quietly, in villages you will never hear of, until I die." She turned her face away then toward the window, and he thought for one cold moment that he had said too much, or the wrong thing, or that the old distance had closed over her again for good. But when she turned back, her eyes were wet, and her composure had a crack in it at last, small but real, and her thread of a voice was not quite steady when she spoke. "Datchet says you are not to tire me," she said. "You had better go and find lodging, my lord. The Fox in the Square is decent enough. You may come again tomorrow, if you wish, at a proper hour, and sit with me a little. I make no promises beyond that." A pause. "And you will not, I think, wish to be seen in that coat. It has been shoveling snow, by the look of it, for 3 days. "It has," he said, and something eased in his chest, for she had noticed the coat, which meant she had looked at him, which was more than she had needed to do. "I found I did not mind the shoveling. I have grown rather fond of being of use." He rose slowly, his knees stiff from the cold floor. At the door he stopped and turned and did not say any of the large things pressing at his throat, for he had learned at last that the large things must be earned before they may be spoken. He said only, "Thank you for letting me see that you are living. Whatever comes of it, I shall be glad of that all my life." And he went softly out and down the dark stair, and stood in the white square in the failing light with the whole weight of his gladness and his fear, a duke-turned pilgrim, waiting to be told day by day and never faster, whether he might be allowed to stay. He took the room at the Fox, and he stayed in Harrowgill, and the days that followed were the strangest, and he would come to think, the best of his life. He did not press. He came to the small rooms above the booksellers each afternoon at the hour Datchet appointed, and he sat. And often he did not talk at all, for Evelina was still very weak and easily wearied, and he had learned, slowly at great cost, but he had learned, that presence which asks nothing is a rarer and dearer gift than presence which asks. He read to her sometimes, when she wished it, from the booksellers' shelves below, and discovered that she liked to be read history and disliked to be read sermons, which he had not known, which no one had ever thought to ask her, and which he set down that night in a small private notebook. He had begun to keep the things he was learning about his own wife, as a man learns a new and difficult and beloved language, but he did more than sit. He made himself useful in Harrowgill, and he did it as she had always done it, quietly and without his name upon it, for he was Mr. Grenholm here, no duke, a plain gentleman come to nurse his sick wife, and he found that he preferred it. The fever was still in the town, and the town was poor. And Cassian, who 3 months before had not known the name of a single tenant, walked the frozen lanes of a strange place carrying coal and beef tea and physic to houses no one else would enter, and sat up the nights with the dying of a parish that was not his, and learned their names, and closed their eyes when it came to that, and did not tell Evelina he was doing it, though of course she knew, for a small town keeps no secrets, and the bookseller's wife told her everything. "They are saying in the market," Evelina remarked one afternoon, some 3 weeks on, when she was strong enough to sit up by the fire wrapped in shawls, "that the tall southern gentleman at the Fox sat all last night with the Sartell family, and that when the old man went at dawn it was Mr. Grenholm who laid him out, and Mr. Grenholm who paid for the coffin and would not let it be known. She was not looking at him, she was looking at the fire. That is a thing I used to do, my lord, in another life, in your house." "I know," he said. "I never knew you did it. I know it now. I am trying to learn to be a person who does it. I do not do it well yet. Old Sartell was a long time going, and I did not always know what to say, and once I think I said the wrong thing, for the daughter wept harder. You would have known what to say. I only knew that someone ought to be there, and that you had taught me so, by being there 10,000 times where I never was." He paused. "I am not telling you this to be praised, Evelina. I would rather you did not praise me. I am telling you because you asked, and because I have made a rule with myself that I will never again let you believe I do not see a thing that you have done. You spent 11 years unseen. I cannot give the years back. But I can promise that from this hour, whatever comes of us, you will never again do a kindness in my knowledge that goes unremarked. It is a small reparation. It is the only one in my power." She was silent a while, and the fire ticked and settled, and then she said very low, "That is the thing I wanted, you know, all those years. Not diamonds, not a place at the head of the table, only to be seen. I used to think there was something wanting in me, that I could not make you see me, that I was, as you said, forgettable, and that it was my fault for being so quiet a thing. It took me 11 years to understand that a person not make herself seen by someone who has decided not to look, and that the fault was never in the seen but in the looker. And when I understood that, I could not stay, not out of anger. I was never very angry, my lord, which perhaps you will not believe. Only I could not go on spending the one life I have being invisible in a beautiful house. It seemed to me a kind of dying, and I found I wanted to live, even plainly, even poor, even as a widow named Hartley in a town where no one knew I was anyone at all, because here at least, when I was kind to a person they looked at me and knew I was there, and I found I had been starving for so long that even the poor bread of a stranger's thanks was a feast. Cassian sat very still and did not trust his voice for a moment. Then he said, I have thought a great deal these months about the thing I said at that table, about calling you plain. And I have understood something that I want to say to you plainly in my turn, because you have been so honest with me. It was not that I looked at you and found you plain, Evelina. That would almost be forgivable. A man may be unlucky in his taste and blind to a fine thing, and it is only foolishness. What I did was worse than that, and I did not understand how much worse until I had lived 3 months in the wreck of it. I did not look at you at all. I did not find you plain. I found you nothing, because I never spent the attention it would have cost to find you anything, and then, when I wanted a cheap laugh at my own table, I reached for the word plain the way a lazy man reaches for the nearest tool. Because you were the nearest thing to hand, and I had never troubled to learn you were not a tool. That is the sin. Not that I misjudged your face. That I never judged you at all, never weighed you, never so much as saw that there was a whole person there to be weighed, and spent 11 years being kept warm and safe and easy by the labor of a soul I had filed away, on the first day, as furniture. His voice was not steady now. You are not plain, Evelina. I have looked at you now, these 3 weeks, more than I looked at you in 11 years, and I will tell you what I see, and you may make of it what you will. I see the finest woman I have ever known or heard of. I see a face I would cross England in the snow to kneel beside, and did, and the tragedy of my life, the whole tragedy of it, and I say it as a fact and not a plea, is that it took your leaving to give me the eyes to see what was 3 feet from my hand the entire time. She was weeping now, quietly, the tears sliding down without any sound, and she made no move to hide them, and he made no move toward her, for he had promised himself he would not, and he kept the promise, though it was the hardest thing he had ever done. He only reached very slowly and set his hand upon the coverlet, palm up, near her own, not touching, an offering and not a demand, a thing she could take or leave, and after a long time, a time in which the fire burned low and neither of them spoke, and the whole question of 2 lives hung in the small, warm, poor room like the smoke above the peat, Evelina Halloway, Duchess of Grenholm, who had curtsied to her husband at his own table and packed her trunk and walked away with a dignity that had unmade him, looked down at that open-offered hand, and she did not take it, not yet. She looked at it a long while, and then she looked up at his face, and there was in her wet eyes something he had never once seen there before, not in 11 years, not composure and not distance, and not the grave, correct patience of a woman enduring her life. There was doubt, and there was hope inside the doubt, and there was, most terrible and most precious of all, the beginning of a question. I am afraid, she said simply, to believe you. Do you understand that? Not because I think you are lying. Because I think you may be true, and I do not know if I could survive believing it and being wrong. I built a whole new life on the certainty that you would never see me. I have been happy, my lord, these months, happier than I ever was in your house, precisely because I stopped hoping. And you are asking me to hope again, and hope is the one thing I swore I would never again spend on Cassian Grenholm as long as I lived. She drew a shaking breath. So I will not take your hand today, not because I do not want to, because I wanted too much, and I do not trust the wanting, and I will not build again on sand. She looked at him steadily through her tears. But you may leave your hand there, my lord, as long as you like, and you may come again tomorrow, and we will see. And Cassian left his hand there, open on the coverlet, near hers and not touching, until the fire was ashes and Datchet came to send him away. and he went out into the black cold and the falling snow with his chest full to breaking of something that was not quite joy and not quite grief, but was, he thought, the thing that comes before both, when a man has at last stopped deserving what he wants and only begun, to hope he might one day be given it anyway. There was one afternoon he set apart from all the others, and kept forever after in the small, locked room of his memory, where a man stores the hours that changed him. It had come on to snow hard by early dusk, and the town was shut up against it. And he had stayed later than the appointed hour because the weather made an excuse of itself, and Datchet had gone down to the bookseller's kitchen. And for the first time since he had come north, he and Evelina were alone together in the small, warm room, no third soul, and no errand and nothing at all to do, but sit either side of the fire he had, that day, at last learned to lay without smoking the room. She was stronger by then, though still thin, and she had taken up a bit of plain sewing to keep her hands busy, and the needle went in and out in the firelight, and Cassian sat and watched her and did not speak, and was, he realized with a kind of astonishment, entirely and perfectly happier, in that poor bare room over a bookseller's shop, doing nothing, saying nothing, only sitting in the same firelight as his wife, than he had ever once been in the whole glittering length of his ducal life. "You are staring, my lord," she said, without looking up from her needle, and there was the faint dry ghost of a smile in it. "I am," he admitted. "I find I cannot stop. I spent 11 years in the same houses as you and never looked at you, and now I have 11 years of looking to make up, and I am greedy about it, and I do not much care if you catch me at it." He was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that had been rising in him all that snowbound afternoon. "Do you know what I am learning, sitting here? I am learning that the thing I threw away was never the grand thing at all. I used to imagine in the great house that happiness was something large and loud, a full table, a good run of cards, a room turning its face to hear me talk. And it was here the whole time, and it was small and quiet, and it looked exactly like this, a fire and a needle going in and out, and a woman who does not need me to be brilliant, only present. I had it, Evelina. I had it every evening of 11 years and never once sat down in it. I let it burn out untended, the way I let everything burn out, because I was too busy being the Duke of Grenholm to be a man in a warm room with his wife." He looked into the fire. "It is the cheapest thing in the world, and I could not buy my way back to it with the whole duchy, because it is not for sale. It is only for those who trouble to sit still in it, and I never troubled. Until now, when I have no right to it, and want it more than I have ever wanted anything I ever had every right to." Evelina's needle had stopped. She sat with it poised above the cloth and did not look at him, and the firelight moved on her face, and when she spoke her voice was very low. "That," she said, "is the truest thing you have ever said to me. In 11 years and 1 winter, the truest. And I do not know what frightens me more, that you are saying it, or that I believe it." And she took up her needle again. "Because a woman must do something with her hands when her heart is turning over." And the snow came down past the small window, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, and it was, Cassian thought, the sweetest silence he had ever been permitted to share. The weeks at Harrowgill before Sir Hugh came settled into a rhythm that Cassian would remember all his life as the truest schooling he ever had. He rose before the town, in the cold dark of his room at the Fox, and went out with the coal cart to the far cottages, and came back near noon snow-caked and spent, and washed, and changed his one plain coat, and climbed the bookseller's stair at the appointed hour to sit with his wife. And in the long low afternoons, while the light failed early over the moor and the fire ate its slow way through the peat, he learned Evelina Halloway as a scholar learns a lost language, patiently, humbly, and with a growing wonder at the depth of the text he had owned and never read. He learned that she had wanted as a girl to be a great deal, and had folded those wantings away one by one when they proved to have no place in a duchess's life, and had never once complained of the folding, and had, he suspected, half forgotten she had ever unfolded them at all until this strange free winter gave her leave to spread them out again in the light. She had wanted to travel. She had a globe once as a girl, and had traced the Nile with her finger, and had married instead and never left 3 counties. She had wanted to know things, history and languages and the names of stars, and had taught herself in stolen hours what governesses had not thought worth teaching a plain girl, and had hidden the learning, because a duchess who knew too much was thought forward, and Cashen, hearing this, understood with a fresh pang that he had lived 11 years beside a mind finer than his own, and never given it a single afternoon's employment. "Why did you never tell me these things?" he asked her once, low, and regretted the question the moment it left him, for the answer was too obvious and too cruel. She only looked at him, not unkindly. "When, my lord?" "At the foot of the table, down the length of the silver, while you talked to Lord Merrow. One does not lean the length of a dining hall and cry out, 'Husband, I have taught myself Italian,' in the hope of being heard over the port. There was never a place made for the telling. I do not say it to wound you. You did not make the place, and I did not know how to make it myself, and so the things went untold year on year, until I stopped believing they were worth the telling, which is the saddest thing that can happen to a person's inward life. Not that no one asks, but that one comes at last to agree there is nothing there worth the asking." She turned her face to the fire. "I did not leave you because you were cruel, Cashen, as I have told you. I left you because I had begun to disappear even to myself, and I found that I would rather be poor and real in a strange town than rich and vanishing in a fine one." He carried that sentence with him for the rest of his life. Rich and vanishing in a fine one. He had done that to her. He had not meant to. He had never once, in 11 years, sat down and decided to make disappear. And that, he understood now, was precisely the horror of it, that the great cruelties of comfortable men are almost never decided upon, but accreted day by careless day, out of nothing worse than not troubling to look, until one morning all living soul has been quietly rubbed out of the picture by the sheer weight of never having been drawn in. He resolved, kneeling in the dark of his room at the Fox that night, that whatever else came of his life, no person in his keeping would ever again be allowed to vanish for want of his attention. And it was a resolution he kept, and it changed not only his own house, but, in the long slow way such things spread, half a county, for a duke who has learned to see becomes, whether he wills it or no, a lens through which a whole small world is made more visible to itself. He made her laugh sometimes in those afternoons, which astonished them both. He had never in 11 years tried to make her laugh. It had not occurred to him that his own wife might be a person whom one would wish to make laugh. But he was clumsy now in 100 small ways, being new to plainness. He did not know how to lay a fire and smoke the room out. He could not for his life mend his own torn cuff, and made a botch of it that Datchet had to undo. He brought her, once meaning flowers, a great absurd armful of moorland gorse whose thorns had shredded his fine gloves, not knowing gorse from any gentler thing, and Evelina, watching this great powerful man of 42 fumble through the ordinary competences that the poorest cottage wife commanded before she was 10, was surprised into laughter more than once, and each time she laughed something in the small room eased. And each time Cashen would have shredded 100 more pairs of gloves to hear it again. "You are very bad at being poor," she told him once, wiping her eyes, having watched him fight a losing war with the smoking fire. "I am," he agreed, on his knees at the hearth, suit to the elbow. "I am discovering that I have been bad at very nearly everything that matters, and good only at the things that do not. It is a humbling inventory. But I find I would rather be bad at laying a fire beside you than excellent at giving orders in an empty house. I am learning the fire. Give me time. I mean to learn all of it, the fire, and the cuff, and the gorse from the sweeter flowers, and everything else I should have learned 20 years ago if I had ever once come down out of my own greatness far enough to notice that other people were carrying the whole of ordinary life on their backs while I admired the view." He got the fire to draw at last, and sat back on his heels, and looked at her through the thinning smoke. "Chiefly I mean to learn you, Evelina. If you will let me, I have made a beginning. I know now that you like history and not sermons, and that you taught yourself Italian, and that you traced the Nile with your finger as a girl, and that you sing in the mornings when you think no one hears. It is not much against 11 wasted years. But it is more than I knew a season ago, and I mean to go on knowing you until I die, and I dare to think, that a whole life given honestly to the knowing of one good soul might, at the very end of it, come to something not entirely unlike a marriage." She did not answer that at once. She looked at him a long while, this changed and sooty and earnest man on her hearthrug, and there was in her face the whole slow war between the woman who had sworn never again to hope and the woman who was, against all her wisdom, beginning to. "You traced my letters," she said finally softly, half to herself. "Before ever you traced me. You wrote a whole winter of yourself into a drawer, thinking no one would read it. And I read it. And do you know what undid me in the end, what it was, out of all of it, that made me begin to believe? It was not the fine phrases. You have always been able to make a fine phrase. A clever, cruel man makes them as easily as a good one. It was the letter about the young mother who died of the fever in the cottage, where you wrote that you had understood, kneeling there, that you might so easily have lost me to just such a fever, unseen and unmourned, and been the last to know. You did not write that to be read, Cassian. You wrote it at 3 in the morning with the candle going out, for no one out of pure grief. And a man does not counterfeit grief at 3 in the morning for a drawer." Her eyes were wet. "That is when I stopped being able to be certain you were only the newest thing a clever, proud man had found to want. That is when I began to be afraid you were true. And you cannot know, you cannot begin to know, how much more frightening it is to be offered the real thing after you have taught yourself to live without it, than simply to go on being disappointed by the false." Cassian did not move toward her. He had learned that much. He only knelt there, sooty and still, and let her be afraid, and did not try to argue the fear away, for he understood at last that her fear was not an obstacle between them, but the very measure of what he had done, and that a love worth having must be strong enough to sit quietly beside another person's fear without demanding that it stop. "Then be afraid as long as you need," he said gently. "I am not going anywhere. I have nowhere in the world I would rather be than kneeling on your hearth, failing to lay a fire. Be afraid for a year if you must. Be afraid until you are sure. I will still be here, learning the gorse from the roses, whenever you are ready to stop being afraid. And if that day never comes, then I will have spent my life learning to be a better man in a small northern town for the love of a woman who chose, wisely, not to trust me. And it will still have been the best use I ever made of the wreck I began with." And Evelina looked at him, and did not stop being afraid. It did not send him away, and outside the small window the short northern day drew down toward its early dark, and the fire he had at last coaxed to life burned steady and warm between them, the first fire of many that Cassian Grenholm had ever built with his own 2 hands. The setback came as setbacks do, from the world Cassian had left behind and thought he had put down. It came in the shape of Sir Hugh Holloway, Evelina's father, who arrived in Harrowgill on a bitter clear morning in a plain post chaise, an old man wrapped against the cold, and who had learned, for the county had a long tongue, and it reached even to the north, that the Duke of Grenholm was lodged at the Fox and calling daily upon his daughter, and had come the whole cold length of England to put a stop to it. Cassian was not there when Sir Hugh climbed the bookseller's stair. He had been out since dawn carrying broth to a stricken cottage on the moor's edge, and he came into the square near noon, snow to the knee, to find the old man's chaise before the shop, and his heart went cold. He climbed the stair 2 at a time and stopped in the doorway, and there was Sir Hugh standing over his daughter's chair by the fire, and Evelina pale and upright, and the air of the small room stretched tight as a drumhead. "There he is," said Sir Hugh, without turning, in a dry cold voice Cassian remembered from a wedding 11 years gone. "The man who called my daughter plain at his own table. Come to mend it with 3 weeks of soup and pretty speeches, I hear." "I have come to take Evelina home to the north, sir, where she has friends who never once found her forgettable, and I will thank you to be gone from this town by morning." Now he turned, and his old eyes were hard and bright with a father's long-hoarded anger. "Do you know what you did to her?" "No." "You cannot. A man like you never knows. I gave you a jewel 11 years ago and told you to your face she was worth more than the world would tell you, and you smiled at me the way a great man smiles at a country fool, and you took her. And you spent 11 years proving me right and yourself the fool, and you did not even have the grace to be cruel about it, which she might have forgiven, but ground her down instead with the slow indifference that is the cruelest thing of all. And now she is ill and free and beginning to be happy, and you come north with your soup. No. I say no. I am her father, and I say no." It was a just speech, every word of it, and Cassian stood and took it without flinching, For he had spent 3 months learning to take the truth without flinching, and this was only the truth spoken aloud by a man who loved her. And here was the test, and he knew it even as it fell upon him, for the old Cashin would have drawn himself up and answered rank with rank, would have reminded this country baronet whom he addressed, would have won the room by force and lost the war forever. He felt the old reflex rise in him like a tide, and he let it fall. "You are right, sir," he said quietly, "in everything. I will not dispute a word of it, for there is not a word to dispute. I did spend 11 years proving you right, and I was the fool, and the indifference was the cruelest thing, and I did not even know I was doing it, which is worse and not better. You gave me a jewel and I used her for furniture. There is no defense. I make none." He came no further into the room. He stood in the doorway, snow melting from his coat onto the bare boards, a large, humbled man. "And if Evelina wishes to go north with you, sir, I will not say one word against it, and I will not follow, and I will trouble her no more. I have told her so, and I tell you so now before her. I have no claim on her. I gave up every claim the night I opened my mouth at that table. I am not here as her husband, sir. I have no right to that name, and I do not use it. I am here only as a man who did a great wrong and is trying, too late, to be worth the smallest fraction of what he threw away, and who could not stay south in comfort, while she lay ill among strangers, and who will go the instant she bids him, and not before, because that instant belongs to her and to no one else in the world." He looked then, not at the father, but past him, to Evelina, and his voice dropped. "Not even to you, sir. With all respect to a father's love, which is a true and good thing, the choosing is hers. She has earned the right to every choice she will ever make for the rest of her life, and I would sooner lose her forever to her own free choosing than keep her 1 hour by any other man's." There was a silence. Sir Hugh's old face worked, for he had come armed for a battle and been given no enemy to fight, and there is nothing so disarming to a righteous anger as a man who agrees with all of it and stands and takes it. And into that silence Evelina spoke, from her chair by the fire, and her voice, though still worn thin by illness, had in it now the old grave strength, the strength of the woman who had curtsied and packed her trunk and walked away. "Papa," she said gently, "I love you, and you came the whole way north for me, and I shall not forget it as long as I live. But he is right, and you must let me say the thing you least wish to hear." She turned her eyes on Cashin, and there was in them at last the thing that had been growing all these weeks. "I have watched him 3 weeks, Papa. I have watched him carry coal up the moor to houses that could never repay him, and sit the nights with strangers dying, and lay out an old he never knew and pay for the coffin and forbid his name to it. I have watched him do, quietly and unwatched, and for no reward, every single thing I used to do alone in his great house, while he sat blind at the head of his table. I did not tell him to do these things. He does not do them to be seen doing them. He does them, I have come to believe, because the doing of them has become who he is, because a man cannot counterfeit 3 months of unwitnessed kindness in a strange town where his title buys him nothing. Her voice caught and steadied. "You taught me, Papa, long ago, that you cannot know a man by what he says at a table full of friends, but only by what he does in a cold house full of strangers. I have seen what he does in the cold house full of strangers, and I find I believe him." She looked back at her father, and she was weeping and smiling at once. "The man who called me plain is gone, Papa. I do not know quite where he went or how, but he is gone, and this one came instead, and this one I think I could, this one I think I might dare to." She could not finish it. She did not need to. Sir Hugh Holloway stood a long moment between the fire and the snow-bright window, an old man watching his daughter choose, and whatever he saw on her face undid the whole armory of his anger, for he had never in his life been able to deny her a true happiness, and this at last, he could see, was true. "Well," he said gruffly, and turned away to the window so they should not see his own eyes. "Well, I am too old to drive back north tomorrow in any case. The roads are shut." He cleared his throat roughly. "I shall stay at the Fox a few days, and I shall watch you, sir, as she has watched you, and I warn you I am a harder judge than my daughter and a great deal less forgiving. But," and here the old dry voice cracked, "just once, if you make her happy, Grenholm, if you truly make her happy after all this, then I shall be the first man in England to beg your pardon, and I shall mean it. He took up his hat and went past Cassian in the doorway and stopped and gripped the younger man's arm once hard and went down the stair without another word. They were alone then, Cassian and Evelina, in the small warm room with the fire and the snow light and the 11 years and the 3 months all pressed together into a single held breath. He came at last from the doorway and crossed the little room and knelt again by her chair, as he had knelt by her bed the day he came, and this time he'd not offer his open hand upon a coverlet and wait. This time she reached out first, thin and worn and trembling, the hand that had mended roofs and held the dying, and she laid it against his cheek. The first time she had touched him in 3 months, the first time, he thought, she had touched him with tenderness in 11 years, and he closed his eyes and turned his face into her palm and was, for a moment, wholly unable to speak. "I am not going north with my father," she said softly above him. "You will have understood that. But I am not coming back to Grenholm as I left it, either. I will not sit at the foot of your table and be your amusement, Cassian. That woman is gone and she is not coming back, and I would not have her back if I could. No," he said, into her hand. "God forbid it. I would not have her back either. I want the other one, the one who left, the one who walked out of my gate with her head up because she was too fine to stay. I want to spend the rest of my life at her side, if she will have me, and I do not mean at the head of any table with her at the foot of it. I mean beside her, Evelina, in one chair or in none. I have learned to mend roofs. I should be glad never to give a dinner again as long as I live." She laughed then, a small broken watery laugh, but a laugh, the first he had ever heard from her, and it was the sweetest sound he had known, sweeter even than the singing he had never heard and hoped now, one day to earn. "You gave good dinners," she said. It was only the company at the head of the table that wanted mending, and she bent and pressed her lips to his brow, once, lightly, a thing given, not taken, and he understood that he had been forgiven, not cheaply, not quickly, not without its long and honest price, but truly and forever. And he bowed his head under it as a man bows under a blessing he has not earned, and has been given all the same. They did not go back to Grenholm that winter. She was too weak to travel, and in truth neither of them was in any haste, for the small poor rooms above the booksellers had come to hold more of their true marriage than the great house ever had, and they lingered in Harrowgill through the thaw. Mr. and Mrs. Grenholm, a plain gentleman and his recovering wife, carrying coal up the moor together when she was strong enough, sitting either side of one fire, learning each other at last, slowly, the way it should have been done 11 years before and now, mercifully, would be. Sir Hugh stayed a fortnight and went home the tenderest of allies, having, true to his word, begged the Duke's pardon on the last morning and meant it, and Datchet, watching the two of them one evening from the doorway with the firelight on their 2 bent heads, wept again, but for the other reason this time, and went down to tell the bookseller's wife that she had lived to see the impossible, which was a proud man made humble and a good woman made happy, both in the one small room. When spring came at last to the moors, they went home together to Grenholm. But a different Grenholm, for he had written ahead this time, not orders, but a request, and the school was thriving, and the widow Marden's roof held, and the whole estate, tended these months in the new way he had begun, hummed with a life it had not known before. The county, which had spent a winter deciding the Duke had run mad, came by degrees to a different verdict when it saw the two of them come home together in the spring, for there is nothing the world respects so grudgingly, nor in the end so completely, as a proud man who has truly humbled himself and been truly forgiven, and made something better on the far side of it than he had ever managed on the near. Lord Merrow called once more, that summer, and found the round table and the small easy company and the Duke listening more than he spoke, and went away subdued, and told no jokes of any one's again in that house, or it was noticed, in any other. And the fine ladies who had once schemed to have their names spoken in the great cold rooms of Grenholm found the rooms warm now, and open, and full of tenants' children learning their letters on wet afternoons, and did not quite know what to make of it, and came anyway, because warmth, once a house has it, draws even those who cannot name what they have come for. But Cassian cared little now for the county's verdicts, good or ill. He had learned the only verdict that had ever mattered, and it sat across the round table from him every evening of his life, and looked at him as though there were no other person in the world, having at last, After 11 wasted years and one long redeeming winter, every reason to. He brought Evelina home not to the foot of any table but to his side, and he never in the remaining years of a long life gave a grand dinner again, but many small ones at a round table he had made for the purpose, where there was no head and no foot, and no one was ever the evening's amusement. And at the first of these, quite late, when the last neighbor had gone and only the two of them remained by the dying fire, Cassian asked his wife, very humbly, whether she thought she might ever, one morning, when she felt like it, and not to please him but only if it pleased herself, whether she thought she might one day sing again. And some weeks later, in the grey light of an early morning, coming down the stair of his own house, the Duke of Grenholm stopped and stood, and did not breathe, for somewhere below a woman was singing low and sweet and unaware of any listener. The sweetest voice old Datchet had said that she had ever heard on a living soul, and Cassian sat down upon the cold stair in his shirt-sleeves like a boy and put his face in his hands and wept and listened, and did not go down and did not spoil it, and let her sing the whole song through to the end for no one, the way she liked it, the way she had always liked it. And when it was done he wiped his face, and rose, and went down at last into the ordinary blessed morning of the rest of his life. To the woman he had once called plain at his own table, and had spent everything he had to learn too late and just in time to see,